This rose will look perfect right here. Oh, the lilies are beautiful.
The golden world and the birth of Kore, long, long ago, before the world learned the meaning of winter, before the trees ever knew the sorrow of losing their leaves. There existed an age so golden, so impossibly beautiful, that even the gods themselves would pause in their celestial halls just to gaze down upon the earth and marvel at its splendor. In that ancient time, the world was wrapped in an eternal spring. The meadows were always green, always soft beneath the bare feet of wandering mortals. Flowers bloomed not in seasons, but in ceaseless celebration, as though the earth herself were singing a quiet hymn of joy that never reached its final note. Rivers ran clear as liquid crystal, murmuring lullabies to the stones they caressed on their long, winding journeys toward the shimmering sea. The air carried the perfume of jasmine and wild thyme, of honeyed blossoms and sun-warmed herbs, and every breath drawn by god or mortal alike was a breath of pure, unhurried sweetness. This was the world that Demeter loved. This was the world she had made. Demeter, golden-haired goddess of the harvest, she who taught the soil to yield its treasures, she who coaxed the seeds from their dark slumber and called the grain to rise tall and proud beneath the generous sun. Demeter, whose laughter could make orchards heavy with fruit, whose tears could turn the richest valley to dust. She was not like the other gods of great Olympus. She did not crave thrones or thunderbolts, did not hunger for temples carved in marble, or songs composed in her glory. What Demeter loved, more than all the honors that heaven could bestow, was the simple miracle of a seed becoming a flower, of a bare field becoming a sea of wheat, of the earth itself breathing and growing and giving life. She walked among mortals often, more often than any other god dared. She walked through their fields at dawn, when the dew still clung to the barley like tiny scattered diamonds. She walked through their orchards at dusk when the apples hung low and the light turned the color of warm amber. The farmers did not always see her, but they felt her presence. They felt it in the unusual richness of their soil, in the way their crops grew taller and stronger than they had any right to grow, in the way the harvest always seemed to come exactly when it was needed most. And the mortals in return loved Demeter with a love that was quiet and true. They left offerings of grain and honey at simple stone altars by the edges of their fields. They whispered prayers to her as they sowed their seeds each year. They named their daughters after her, hoping that some echo of her warmth and generosity might live in the hearts of their children. In all the wide world, there was no goddess more beloved by humankind, and no goddess who returned that love more faithfully. But Demeter's greatest love was not for the fields or the mortals who tended them. It was not for Olympus with its gleaming halls, or for the wide green earth with its endless meadows. Demeter's greatest love, the love that defined her very being, the love around which her immortal heart revolved like the earth revolves around the sun, was her love for her daughter. Her daughter, the child who had come into being from the union of Demeter and great Zeus, king of the gods, lord of the thundering sky. It was a union born not of lasting devotion, for Zeus's affections wandered as freely as the wind, but from it had come something more precious than all the gold and all the mountains of the world. From it had come a child so extraordinary, so luminous, that the moment she first opened her eyes, the flowers in the nearest meadow bloomed twice over, as if the earth itself wished to welcome her with the finest gift it could offer. They called her Kore. It meant simply the maiden, for she was maidenhood itself made divine. But she would come to be known by another name, a name whispered with reverence and with awe, a name that would echo through the ages long after the temples of the old gods had crumbled to ruin. She would come to be known as Persephone. But that name and the destiny it carried lay far in the future. In those early sunlit days, she was simply Kore, the daughter of Demeter, and she was the joy of her mother's eternal life. For the very first moment Demeter held her, she knew that this child was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The baby did not cry as mortal infants cried. Instead, she gazed up at her mother with eyes that were deep and calm, eyes the color of new spring leaves, eyes that seemed already to hold within them some ancient knowing. some quiet understanding of the great mysteries that lay hidden beneath the surface of things. And when the baby smiled, which she did often and easily, the room filled with the fragrance of wildflowers, so sweet and so sudden that even the other gods, who were accustomed to wonders, paused and looked about in gentle amazement. Demeter raised her daughter not upon Olympus, among the quarrels and intrigues of the gods, but upon the earth, among the growing things she loved. She chose for their home the most beautiful place she could find, a wide and rolling landscape of green hills and golden valleys on the island of Sicily, where the sun was warm and the soil was rich, and the sea sang its endless song against cliffs of white stone. There, in a grove of ancient olive trees, whose silver-green leaves whispered secrets to the wind, Demeter made a dwelling place of simple beauty, and there she devoted herself to the raising of her miraculous child. The childhood of Cora was a thing of legend even among the immortals. She grew not as mortal children grew, in fits and starts, in clumsy stumbles and slow awakenings, but with the graceful inevitability of a flower unfolding its petals to the sun. Each day she seemed to grow more radiant, more alive, more deeply connected to the living world around her. She spoke her first words not to her mother, but to a small blue flower growing by the doorstep, and the flower, it was said, leaned toward her as if listening. By the time she could walk, the fields around their home had become a paradise beyond anything even Demeter had imagined. Wherever little Cora set her foot, green things sprang up as if summoned by a silent command. Grass grew thicker and softer in her footprints. Wildflowers opened their faces and turned toward her as sunflowers turned toward the light. Butterflies followed her in lazy, colorful clouds, and songbirds perched upon her shoulders and sang melodies so sweet that even the wind paused to listen. Demeter watched all of this with a love so fierce and so tender that it sometimes frightened her. She had seen, in her long immortal life, how the gods could be cruel to one another, how jealousy and ambition could turn the hearts of even the mightiest Olympians into cold and bitter things. She had seen Zeus himself betray those closest to him without a moment of remorse. She had seen Hera's jealousy turn innocent maidens into cows and bears and spiders. She had seen the pettiness, the vindictiveness, the casual cruelty that lurked beneath the golden surface of divine life. And she was determined, with every fiber of her being, that none of that darkness would ever touch her daughter. So Demeter became both mother and guardian, both teacher and protector. She taught Cora the names of every flower and every tree, every herb and every grain. She taught her how to call the rain gently from a clear sky, how to coax a withered plant back to health with nothing more than a whispered word and a gentle touch. She taught her the old songs of the earth, songs that had no words but only feelings, songs of growth and renewal, of patience and quiet strength. And Cora learned all of these things with a quickness and a joy that made Demeter's heart overflow with pride. But she also taught her daughter caution. She taught her that the world, for all its beauty, held dangers that even a goddess must respect. She taught her that the other gods, however charming they might seem, were not always to be trusted. She taught her, without ever speaking his name directly, that there were those among the immortals who might one day look upon her beauty and desire to possess it for themselves. Cora listened to these warnings with her usual quiet attentiveness, but in truth, she could not quite believe them. The world she knew was a world of sunlight and flowers, of singing birds and gentle breezes, of her mother's warm embrace and the sweet, slow rhythm of the growing seasons. What darkness could possibly exist in such a world? What danger could touch her here, in this paradise her mother had made? She was young, after all, and youth, whether mortal or divine, has a way of believing that the light will last forever. And so the days passed in that golden land, one after another, each as beautiful as the last, each filled with small wonders and quiet joys. Demeter and her daughter walked together through the fields at dawn, their bare feet wet with dew, their laughter carried away by the morning breeze. They sat together in the olive grove at noon, sharing bread and figs and stories, while the cicadas sang their drowsy songs in the shimmering heat. They watched the sun set over the western sea each evening, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and Demeter would hold her daughter close and whisper that she loved her, that she would always love her, that nothing in all the world would ever part them. And Cora would smile and nestle closer, believing every word, for this was still the time before the earth cracked open, before the darkness reached up with greedy hands, before the world learned what it meant to lose something so precious that its absence could turn an eternal summer into the coldest, cruelest winter the earth had ever known. But that time was coming. Slowly, silently, inevitably, it was coming. The seeds of what would happen had already been sown, deep in the dark places of the world, where even the sun's light could not reach, and they were already beginning to grow. Far, far below the sunlit surface of the earth, in a realm of shadow and silence, someone was watching. Someone was waiting. Someone had seen the maiden called Kore, had glimpsed her beauty in a shaft of light that somehow found its way down through the cracks in the world, and had felt something stir in a heart that had not stirred in 1,000 years. But for now, the sun was warm, the flowers were blooming, and Cora danced through the meadows of Sicily with flowers in her hair and joy in her eyes, knowing nothing of what lay beneath her feet, knowing nothing of the dark king who sat upon his throne of black stone far below, and thought of her, and longed for her, and made his plans in silence. For now, the world was golden, and the maiden danced on, the maiden among the flowers, as the years passed, though years meant little to those who lived beyond the reach of time. Kore grew from a luminous child into a young woman of such breathtaking beauty that the very concept of beauty itself seemed to have been invented solely to describe her. She was tall and slender, with limbs as graceful as the stems of lilies swaying in a summer breeze. Her hair was long and dark, dark as the fertile soil her mother loved, and it fell about her shoulders in waves that caught the sunlight and turned it into something richer, something warmer, something almost alive. Her skin was smooth and fair, touched with the faintest golden glow, as though she carried within her a small, secret sun that shone softly through her mortal-seeming form. And her eyes, those remarkable eyes that had been so calm and knowing even in infancy, had deepened into pools of green so vivid, so full of light and life in hidden depths, that those who looked into them often forgot, for a moment, what they had been about to say. But it was not merely her physical beauty that set Kore apart. There were many beautiful goddesses upon Olympus, many nymphs and spirits whose loveliness could stop the heart of any mortal man. What made Kore extraordinary was something deeper, something that radiated from within her like warmth from a hearth fire on a cold night. She possessed a quality of presence, of aliveness, that made everything around her seem more vivid, more real, more worthy of attention. When she walked through a meadow, the colors of the flowers seemed brighter. When she laughed, the air itself seemed to sparkle. When she sat quietly and listened to the wind in the olive trees, even the silence seemed to become something beautiful, something worth savoring. She was not alone in her paradise, for Demeter, protective though she was, understood that her daughter needed companions of her own age and spirit, and so Kore spent her days in the company of a band of nymphs, those lovely minor goddesses who inhabited the wild places of the earth. They were the Oceanids, daughters of the great river Oceanus, whose laughter sounded like water tumbling over smooth stones. There were the nymphs of the meadows, the Laemoniads, who knew the name and nature of every blade of grass. And there were the nymphs of the flowers, the Anthusae whose hair was petaled, and whose skin carried the fragrance of the blossoms they tended. Among these companions, Kore was not a leader, though she could have been. She was not commanding or imperious, not proud or demanding as so many of the children of Zeus tended to be. She was simply herself, gentle and curious, and endlessly delighted by the world around her, and her companions loved her for it with a devotion that was pure and uncomplicated. They braided flowers into each other's hair. They chased each other through fields of tall grass, their laughter rising like music into the warm air. They swam in cool, clear pools fed by mountain springs, and lay afterward on sun-warmed rocks, telling stories and sharing secrets, while the afternoon light grew long and golden around them. These were days of perfect, untroubled innocence, and Kor moved through them with the unself-conscious grace of one who has never known fear, never known loss, never known the sharp and bitter taste of sorrow. The world was her garden, and she tended it with love, and it gave back to her 1,000-fold. Her gift with growing things had only strengthened as she matured. What had been a charming childish talent had blossomed into a power that was truly awesome in its scope and subtlety. She could touch the bark of a dying tree and feel the faint fading pulse of life within it, and with a whisper and a gentle pressure of her fingertips, she could send that pulse surging back, could fill the withered trunk with fresh vitality, until new leaves burst forth from branches that had been bare and gray. She could hold a handful of dry seeds and know, without being told, exactly what each one would become, could feel the potential locked within those tiny husks, as clearly as a musician hears the symphony hidden within the silence before the first note sounds. And flowers, above all else, were her domain. She loved them with a passion that went beyond mere fondness, that approached something like kinship. She understood them in a way that no other being, mortal or divine, had ever understood them. She knew why the rose bore thorns, and why the violet hid beneath its leaves. She knew why some flowers opened only at night, and why others turned their faces always toward the sun. She knew the language they spoke in colors and in scents, a language older than words, older than thought itself, and she spoke it fluently. Demeter watched her daughter's growing powers with a complex mixture of pride and apprehension. Pride, because Cora was becoming something magnificent, a goddess whose gifts surpassed even her mother's considerable abilities. But apprehension, too, because beauty and power in the world of the gods were dangerous things to possess. They attracted attention. They inspired desire, and desire among the immortals was a force that could reshape the world and break the hearts of those caught in its path. Demeter had taken precautions, of course. She had spoken to Zeus, reminding him of his duty as Cora's father, asking him to ensure that no god would approach their daughter without her mother's knowledge and consent. Zeus had agreed readily enough, though his agreement carried the casual weightlessness of a promise made by someone who had broken 1,000 promises before. Demeter had also chosen their home in Sicily with care, selecting a place far from the well-traveled paths of gods and heroes, a place sheltered and secluded, where her daughter might grow and flourish in peace. But there were forces at work that even Demeter, with all her wisdom and all her love, could not foresee or control. Deep beneath the earth, in the vast and lightless kingdom that mortals spoke of only in whispers, there ruled a god whose name was seldom spoken aloud, for it was believed that to speak it was to draw his cold attention. He was Hades, brother of Zeus, brother of Poseidon, and lord of all the dead. When the three great brothers had divided the cosmos among themselves after their victory over the Titans, Zeus had claimed the sky, Poseidon had claimed the sea, and Hades, the eldest and perhaps the most patient, had accepted the realm that no one else desired, the sunless kingdom beneath the earth where the shades of the departed wandered in eternal twilight. It was not a punishment, this kingdom of his, though it might have seemed so to those who loved the sunlight. Hades had accepted it willingly, even stoically understanding that the dead needed a ruler, just as the living did, and that the balance of the cosmos required someone to watch over the shadowed half of existence. He was not evil, this Dark Lord, not cruel in the way that mortals imagined. He was simply solemn, serious, burdened by the weight of a responsibility that allowed no rest and offered no joy. He sat upon his throne of black obsidian, in his palace of dark stone, and he judged the souls that came before him, and he maintained the order of his realm with a quiet, unyielding authority that even the other gods respected, and perhaps feared. But Hades was also desperately, achingly alone. His brothers had wives, had lovers, had children who filled their halls with noise and life and laughter. Zeus had Hera, and besides Hera, a parade of mortal and immortal loves that seemed to grow longer with each passing century. Poseidon had Amphitrite and the wild, untamed court of the sea. Even the lesser gods had their companions, their romances, their tangled webs of affection and desire. But who would willingly come to the land of the dead? Who would choose to leave the sunlit world above and descend into the darkness to share the bed and the throne of the Lord of Shadows? Hades had asked himself this question 1,000 times, and the answer was always the same. No one. No one would come willingly. And so he sat alone in his vast, echoing palace, surrounded by the silent shades of those who had once lived and loved and laughed, and he endured his solitude as he endured all things with grim, unbroken patience, until the day he saw her. The accounts differ on how it happened. Some say that Hades rose briefly to the surface world to inspect a crack in the earth near the slopes of Mount Etna, a crack through which the fires of the deep were seeping, and that as he emerged, blinking into the unaccustomed brightness of the mortal sun, he caught sight of a young goddess dancing in a distant meadow, and the sight pierced him like an arrow through the heart. Others say that it was Aphrodite herself, goddess of love, who directed his gaze toward Kore, mischievous Aphrodite who could not bear the thought that any corner of the cosmos should be free from the sweet tyranny of desire. Still others say that it was simply fate, that great implacable force before which even the gods must bow, that arranged for the Lord of the Dead to look upon the Maiden of the Flowers and fall into a love so sudden, so overwhelming, so absolute, that it would change the very nature of the world. However it happened, the result was the same. Hades saw Kore. He saw her dancing barefoot through a field of wildflowers, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner, her green eyes bright with laughter, her slender arms outstretched as if to embrace the whole of the sunlit world. And something within him, something buried so deep that he had forgotten it existed, something that had lain dormant through all the long cold centuries of his solitary reign, suddenly and violently awoke. He loved her. In that single shattering instant, he loved her with a love that was as vast and as dark and as inescapable as his own kingdom. He loved her not as the gods of Olympus loved, carelessly and briefly, with a passion that flared bright and burned out like a falling star. He loved her with the enduring, unyielding love of one who has waited an eternity for something without even knowing that he was waiting, and who recognizes it the moment it appears with a certainty that goes beyond reason, beyond thought, beyond everything except the raw, trembling truth of the heart. And in that moment of recognition, as he stood at the edge of the sunlit world and watched the maiden dance, the Lord of the Dead made a decision that would set in motion the greatest upheaval the world had ever known. He would have her. She would be his queen. But first, he needed permission, and for that he went not to Demeter, whose answer he already knew, but to Zeus, king of the gods and father of the maiden. Zeus, who owed his brother much, and who had never been overly concerned with the wishes of mothers or daughters when matters of power and alliance were at hand. And far away, in her sunlit meadow, Kore danced on, knowing nothing of the dark eyes that had watched her, knowing nothing of the love that had been kindled in the deepest place in all the world, knowing nothing of the storm that was gathering just beyond the horizon of her golden, innocent days. The flowers swayed around her in the warm breeze, and the nymphs sang, and the world was beautiful, and she was happy. She was so very, very happy. The bargain of the Dark King, the palace of Zeus, stood upon the highest peak of Mount Olympus, above the clouds, above the storms, above the reach of mortal sight and mortal understanding. It was a place of dazzling grandeur, its halls paved with gold, its columns carved from living crystal, its vast courtyards open to a sky that was always clear, always blue, always radiant with a light that seemed to come not from the sun, but from the very air itself. Here the gods feasted and quarreled and loved and schemed, and here the fate of the world was decided, sometimes with great deliberation, and sometimes with a careless wave of an immortal hand. It was to this place that Hades came, rising from the depths of the earth through passages known only to him, ascending through the roots of the great mountain itself, until he emerged into the blinding brightness of the celestial realm. He came alone, without attendants, without ceremony, for Hades was not a god who cared for pomp or display. He came wrapped in a cloak of deep shadow, his face pale and stern, his dark eyes holding the quiet intensity of one who has made a decision from which he will not be turned aside. The other gods watched his approach with unease. Hades rarely visited Olympus. His appearances were so infrequent that many of the younger gods had never seen him at all, knew him only as a name spoken in hushed tones, a shadowy figure associated with endings and silence, and the cold finality of the grave. Even among his fellow Olympians, those who knew him well, his presence inspired a certain discomfort, a vague sense of mortality that the immortals found deeply unsettling. When Hades walked through the golden halls, the laughter seemed to dim, the music seemed to falter, and even the eternal light of Olympus seemed to grow just slightly, almost imperceptibly less bright. Zeus received his brother in the great throne room, a chamber so vast that clouds drifted through its upper reaches, and eagles soared among its crystal pillars. The king of the gods sat upon his throne of ivory and gold, his thunderbolt resting casually across his knees, his expression one of studied ease that did not quite conceal the wariness beneath. For Zeus was many things, clever and powerful and charming and ruthless. But he was not a fool, and he knew that when Hades troubled himself to climb from the underworld to the heights of Olympus, the matter at hand was one of considerable weight. "Brother," said Hades, and his voice was deep and measured, carrying within it the resonance of vast underground chambers and the quiet authority of one accustomed to absolute rule. "I have come to ask something of you, something I have never asked before." Zeus studied his brother with those keen, sky-colored eyes that missed nothing. He noted the unusual tension in Hades' bearing, the way the dark god's hands were clasped tightly before him, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his voice. These were signs of emotion, and emotion was something Zeus had never before associated with his grim and stoic elder brother. This alone was enough to make the king of the gods pay very close attention. "Ask," said Zeus, with a magnanimity that came easily to one who could always refuse. And Hades told him, in plain, unadorned words, without poetry or persuasion, without the elaborate rhetorical flourishes that the Olympian gods so loved, Hades told his brother that he had seen the maiden Kore, daughter of Demeter, and that he loved her, and that he wished to take her as his wife and queen. He spoke of his loneliness, though he spoke of it without self-pity, stating it as a simple fact, as one might state that the sun rises in the east. He spoke of his kingdom, vast and rich beyond mortal comprehension, filled with all the gold and silver and precious gems that lay hidden in the earth's deep places. He spoke of the honor he would give her, the throne he would share with her, the devotion he would show her for all eternity. And when he had finished speaking, he stood in silence and waited for his brother's answer. Zeus was quiet for a long time. The king of the gods was thinking. And when Zeus thought, the calculations that moved behind his calm, handsome face were as complex and as far-reaching as the movements of the stars. He considered the politics of the situation first, for Zeus always considered politics first. An alliance between his daughter and his brother would strengthen the bonds between Olympus and the underworld, bonds that had grown thin and frayed over the long centuries of Hades' isolation. It would give Zeus influence in the one realm that currently lay beyond his direct control. It would settle the question of Kore's future, a question that had begun to concern him, for the girl was growing more beautiful and more powerful with each passing year, and beauty and power in an unmarried goddess were an invitation to conflict among the gods who would compete for her hand. He considered Demeter next, and here his thoughts grew more cautious. He knew that Demeter would never consent to this match. Never. She would rage and weep and threaten. She would see it as a betrayal of the worst kind, the consignment of her beloved daughter to the land of the dead, to a life of darkness and shadow, far from the sunlight and the flowers she loved. Zeus knew Demeter's temper. He knew the depth of her love for Kore. He knew that opposing her in this matter would bring consequences that even the king of the gods might struggle to manage. But then again, Zeus had never been overly troubled by consequences. He had spent his long immortal life making decisions that pleased him in the moment, and dealing with the aftermath as it came, confident in his ability to manage, to manipulate, to bend the world to his will through a combination of power and charm and ruthless pragmatism. Demeter would be angry, yes, but Demeter would also, eventually, have no choice but to accept what had been done. She was powerful, but she was not more powerful than Zeus himself. And in the end, the king of the gods reasoned, she would bow to the inevitable, as all beings, mortal and immortal alike, eventually must. And so Zeus made his decision. He looked at his brother, this dark and lonely king who stood before him, asking for the one thing that all his vast wealth and all his grim authority could not provide, and he said yes. But it was a particular kind of yes, a Zeus kind of yes. hedged and conditional, and designed to give the king of the gods maximum advantage. With minimum responsibility, he would not announce the marriage publicly. He would not seek Demeter's blessing. He would not, in fact, involve himself openly in the matter at all. What he would do, he told Hades, was simply not interfere. He would look the other way. He would ensure that, at the appointed time, the maiden would be in a place where Hades could reach her, and he would make certain that no other god would come to her aid. In other words, Zeus gave his brother permission to take Kore by force. It was a monstrous thing, this bargain struck between brothers in the golden throne room of Olympus. It was a betrayal not only of Demeter, but of Kore herself, whose wishes were never sought, whose voice was never heard, whose future was decided in her absence by two gods who viewed her not as a person with her own heart and her own desires, but as a prize to be allocated, a piece to be moved on the great game board of divine politics. This was the way of the old gods, the casual cruelty of beings who had lived so long and wielded so much power that they had forgotten, if they ever knew, what it meant to be vulnerable, to be powerless, to be at the mercy of forces greater than oneself. Hades accepted the terms without hesitation. He was not blind to the ugliness of what was being arranged. He was not so lost in his love that he could not see the shadow of injustice that lay across the bright surface of his desire. But he had lived for eons in the darkness, had spent an eternity in solitude that would have driven lesser beings to madness, and the promise of companionship, of love, of a presence that would fill the echoing silence of his palace with warmth and life, was a promise too powerful to resist. He told himself that he would be kind to her. He told himself that she would learn to love the underworld as he loved it, that she would come to see the dark beauty in his kingdom, the quiet majesty of the deep places, the solemn grandeur of a realm that, though it lacked the sun, possessed wonders of its own that the bright world above could never match. He told himself these things, and perhaps he even believed them, and so the plan was set in motion. But it required one more element, one final piece of divine cunning, to ensure that the abduction would succeed without interference. The maiden Kore, for all her innocence, was still the daughter of two great Olympian gods. She was rarely alone. She was always surrounded by her nymph companions, always within the protective orbit of her watchful mother. To seize her openly would invite resistance, would create a scene that might alert Demeter before the deed was done. What was needed was a lure, something irresistible, something that would draw Kore away from her companions, if only for a moment, and bring her to a place where the earth could open and the Dark King could claim his bride. And for this, Zeus turned to Gaia, the ancient Earth Mother, the primordial goddess from whose body the world itself had been born. Gaia, who was grandmother to all the gods, who understood the deep currents of fate and necessity that flowed beneath the surface of events, who saw the great pattern of things in a way that even the Olympians, with all their power, could not. Zeus asked Gaia to create a flower, a single extraordinary flower, unlike anything that had ever grown upon the face of the earth. A flower so beautiful, so intoxicating, so utterly irresistible, that no goddess with a love of growing things could possibly walk past it without stopping to admire it, to reach for it, to pluck it from the earth. And Gaia, whether out of obedience to Zeus or out of her own mysterious understanding of what the world required, agreed. She reached deep into her own essence, into the creative force that had shaped mountains and carved rivers and filled the oceans with life, and she fashioned something new, a flower that had never existed before and would never exist again. A bloom of extraordinary beauty, with 100 heads springing from a single root, a fragrance so overwhelmingly sweet that it could be smelled from one end of the earth to the other, and petals of such perfect, luminous beauty that gods and mortals alike would tremble at the sight of it. It was the Narcissus, not the common Narcissus that would later bear the name, but the original, the divine prototype, a creation of such supernatural beauty that the wide heaven above and the whole earth and the salt swell of the sea laughed for joy at the sight of it. And Gaia planted it in a meadow, a specific meadow far from Demeter's watchful eyes, in a place called Nysa, a place whose exact location would later be debated by scholars and poets for thousands of years. There, among the ordinary wildflowers, the divine Narcissus waited, its 100 heads nodding gently in the breeze, its impossible fragrance drifting outward like a whispered invitation, patient and perfect and deadly as a trap. All was ready. The bargain had been struck. The lure had been set. The Dark King waited in his kingdom below, his chariot harnessed, his immortal horses stamping with impatience in the perpetual gloom. And somewhere above, in a sunlit meadow on the other side of the world, a young goddess laughed and ran through the flowers with her friends, her dark hair flying, her green eyes bright, unaware that the ground beneath her feet was not as solid as she believed, unaware that the world she knew and loved was about to crack open like an egg, revealing the darkness that had always been there, waiting just beneath the surface. The meadow of Nysa. It was a morning like any other morning in the eternal spring of the world. The sun rose golden and warm over the meadow of Nysa, painting the dew-touched grass in shades of amber and pearl. The sky was clear, endlessly clear, a dome of perfect blue that stretched from horizon to horizon, without a single cloud to mar its radiance. Birds sang in the olive groves that bordered the meadow, their melodies weaving together into a tapestry of sound so lovely that it seemed the very air was made of music. Kore came to the meadow that morning with her companions, the nymphs who had been her friends and playmates for as long as she could remember. They came laughing, as they always did, their bare feet whispering through the soft grass, their voices bright and careless, and full of the simple happiness of beings who have never known sorrow. There were many of them that day, a whole joyful company of maiden goddesses, daughters of ocean and daughters of the meadow and daughters of the wood, and they spread out across the wide field like scattered petals, each drawn to the flowers that called to her. And such flowers they were. The meadow of Nysa was famous even among the gods for the beauty and variety of its blossoms. Here grew roses of every shade, from the palest blush of dawn to the deepest crimson of a setting sun. Here grew crocuses, gold and purple and white, their delicate cups brimming with sweet nectar. Here grew hyacinths, their fragrance heavy and intoxicating, their petals the color of a twilight sky. Here grew violets, modest and sweet, hiding beneath their heart-shaped leaves, like shy children peeping out from behind their mother's skirts. And here grew irises, tall and proud, their petals painted in swirls of blue and purple and gold that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Kore moved among them with the reverent joy of one entering a temple. She knelt beside the roses and cupped their faces gently in her hands, breathing in their scent with closed eyes and a smile of pure contentment. She trailed her fingers through the crocuses and laughed softly as they leaned toward her touch. She gathered hyacinths and violets and irises in great fragrant armfuls, piling them into the folds of her gown until the fabric overflowed with color and perfume. Her companions did the same, each gathering the flowers she loved best, and the meadow rang with their happy voices as they called to one another, showing off their prettiest finds, weaving garlands for each other's hair, playing the gentle, aimless games of beings who have all of eternity to spend, and no reason to spend it on anything but joy. And then Kore saw it. It was some distance from the others, growing alone at the far edge of the meadow where the grass was thickest, and the shade of the surrounding trees began to encroach upon the open field. At first, she thought it was simply a trick of the light, a reflection of the sun upon the dew, for it seemed to glow with a radiance that no ordinary flower could possess. But as she drew closer, shielding her eyes against the brightness, she saw that it was real, and her breath caught in her throat, and the armful of flowers she carried fell forgotten to the ground. It was the narcissus, the divine narcissus planted by Gaia at the command of Zeus, and it was more beautiful than anything Kore had ever seen or imagined. 100 blooms sprang from a single thick, green stem, each one perfect, each one luminous, each one a miracle of form and color that defied description. The petals were white, but not merely white. They were the white of fresh snow on a mountaintop at dawn, the white of moonlight on still water, the white of a cloud lit from within by hidden lightning. And at the center of each bloom, a cup of gold so pure and so bright that it seemed to contain within it a tiny captured piece of the sun itself. But it was the fragrance that truly overwhelmed her. It reached her before she was within 10 paces of the flower, a scent so sweet, so deep, so impossibly rich and complex, that it seemed to bypass her senses entirely and speak directly to her soul. It was the scent of every flower she had ever loved, combined and concentrated and elevated to a pitch of perfection that made her dizzy with wonder. It was the scent of spring itself, distilled to its purest essence. It was, quite simply, the most beautiful thing she had ever experienced, and it drew her forward with a force that was gentle but irresistible, like the pull of the tide, like the call of a voice she had known and loved in some half-remembered dream. She reached for it. Of course she reached for it. How could she not? She who loved flowers more than anything in the world, who understood them and cherished them, and spoke their silent language as fluently as she spoke her own. She reached for the narcissus with both hands, her green eyes wide with wonder, her lips parted in a gasp of awed delight, and her fingers closed around the thick stem, and she pulled. The flower came free from the earth with a sound. Not the soft, moist whisper of roots releasing their hold on the soil, but a deeper sound, a groaning, grinding sound, like the voice of the earth itself crying out in pain. And then the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Cor stumbled backward, the narcissus still clutched in her hands, and stared in horror as the meadow before her split open like a wound. The earth cracked and heaved and fell away, and from the widening chasm there rose a blast of cold air that smelled not of flowers and sunlight, but of stone and darkness and the deep mineral breath of the world's hidden places. The crack widened, deepened, became a great yawning gulf, and from its depths there came a sound of hooves, the thunder of horses galloping upward through the dark, and then, rising from the abyss like a nightmare made real, came a chariot. It was black, black as midnight, black as the space between the stars, black as the absolute absence of all light and all hope. It was drawn by 4 horses, immortal horses, their coats the color of smoke, their eyes burning with a cold fire, their hooves striking sparks from the empty air as they surged upward out of the earth and into the brightness of the mortal sun. And standing in the chariot, the reins gripped tight in his pale hands, his dark robes billowing around him like wings, was Hades. Chorus screamed. It was a scream of pure primal terror, a sound torn from the depths of her being by a fear so sudden and so overwhelming that it obliterated thought, obliterated reason, obliterated everything except the desperate animal instinct to flee. She turned to run, but she was too slow, far too slow. The chariot was beside her in an instant, and a strong arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her from the ground as easily as she had lifted the flowers from the meadow. And she was pulled into the chariot and pressed against a chest that was hard and cold as stone. She screamed again, screamed for her mother, screamed for her companions, screamed for anyone who might hear and come to save her. And her companions heard. The nymphs turned toward the sound, their faces white with shock, and they saw their beloved Kore in the arms of the dark god, saw the chariot wheeling in the air, saw the great chasm in the earth still gaping wide, and they cried out in horror and ran toward her with their arms outstretched. But they were too late. The chariot plunged downward, back into the abyss from which it had come, and Hades held Korra tight against him as the light of the sun was swallowed by the darkness, as the blue sky vanished above them and was replaced by a ceiling of raw stone, as the sweet air of the meadow gave way to the cold, stale breath of the underground. The nymphs' cries faded behind them, growing thin and distant and finally silent, and the crack in the earth groaned and shuddered, and began, slowly, to close. The last thing Kore saw, as she looked upward through her tears, was a narrow strip of blue sky, growing thinner and thinner, like a closing eye. And then even that was gone, and there was only darkness, and the thunder of hooves, and the relentless downward plunge into the deep places of the world. She cried out one final time, a single word that echoed through the underground passages, and rose, faint and distorted, through the cracks in the earth to the surface world above. Mother. And the earth closed over her, and the meadow of Nysa was still. The narcissus lay where it had fallen, its 100 blooms already beginning to wilt, its golden cups dimming, its fragrance fading on the warm and indifferent air. The other flowers stood unchanged, still bright, still beautiful, still nodding gently in the breeze, as if nothing at all had happened, as if the world had not just been broken in a way that could never fully be repaired. And far away, in a distant field, Demeter suddenly stopped what she was doing and stood very still. A chill passed through her, a cold so sharp and so sudden that it made her gasp. She did not know yet what had happened. She did not know that her daughter had been taken, that the earth itself had conspired against her, that the golden world she had built with such love and such care had been shattered in an instant by the greed of gods and the silence of those who should have protected what she loved. But she felt it, deep in her immortal heart, in that place where a mother's bond with her child resides beyond the reach of reason or explanation. She felt it. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. And the warmth of the sun on her face suddenly felt like a lie. The wandering of Demeter. The moment the chill touched her heart, Demeter began to run. She did not know where she was running to, did not know what she was running from, knew only that her daughter needed her, that something had gone wrong in the deep fabric of the world, and that she must find Kore, must reach her, must hold her and keep her safe, as she had always held her, as she had always kept her safe, since the first moment she had drawn breath. She ran to the meadow first, to the place where she had left Kore that morning with her nymph companions. But the meadow was empty. The flowers were there, still blooming, still beautiful, but the nymphs were gone, scattered in panic, and of Kore there was no sign, only the fallen narcissus, its wilted petals already turning brown, and a strange disturbance in the earth, a roughness in the soil, as if something vast and violent had pushed its way up from below, and then retreated again, leaving only this subtle scar upon the surface. Demeter called her daughter's name. She called it once, twice, 100 times, her voice rising from a whisper to a cry, to a scream that shook the leaves from the trees and sent the birds wheeling in terrified circles against the darkening sky. She called until her divine throat was raw, until the echoes of her voice came back to her from the distant mountains, mocking her with their emptiness. But no answer came. The meadow was silent. The earth was silent. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. And then the panic set in. Not the controlled, purposeful urgency of a goddess marshalling her powers to meet a crisis, but the raw, mindless, consuming panic of a mother who cannot find her child. It swept through Demeter like a wildfire, burning away reason, burning away dignity, burning away everything except the desperate primal need to search, to seek, to find. She searched the meadow on her hands and knees, parting the grass with trembling fingers, as if Kore might somehow be hiding among the flowers, like a lost fawn. She searched the olive groves, calling and calling, her voice growing hoarse and desperate. She searched the streams and the pools, the rocky hillsides and the shadowed valleys, every place where a young goddess might wander, every place where she might have strayed. She found nothing, no trace, no sign, no footprint, no thread of clothing caught on a thorn. It was as if Kore had simply ceased to exist, had been erased from the surface of the world as completely as a word erased from a tablet of wax. When night fell, Demeter did not stop. She lit 2 great torches, one in each hand, flames that burned with a fierce, unearthly light, and she carried them through the darkness, searching by their glow as she had searched by the light of the sun. Through the long hours of the night she wandered, over mountains and across rivers, through forests so dark and dense that no mortal could have found a path, across plains so wide and empty that the stars above seemed close enough to touch. She did not eat, she did not drink, she did not rest. She was beyond such things now, beyond the needs of the body, sustained by nothing but the terrible burning engine of her fear and her love. For 9 days and 9 nights Demeter searched the earth, 9 days of unbroken anguish, 9 nights of torchlit wandering through a world that seemed to have turned its back on her. She questioned every god and every mortal she encountered, but none could tell her what had happened. None had seen the abduction. None knew where Kore had gone, or if they knew, they would not say, for the gods of Olympus had learned of Zeus's arrangement with Hades, and none among them wished to be the one to tell Demeter the truth. They looked away when she approached. They mumbled vague sympathies and retreated behind their palace walls. They were afraid, not of Hades, not of Zeus, but of the grief they saw burning in Demeter's eyes, a grief so vast and so wild that it seemed capable of consuming the world itself. On the 10th day, at last, a voice spoke to her from the shadows. It was Hecate, goddess of the crossroads, mistress of the dark hours between midnight and dawn. Hecate, who dwelt in a cave lit by a single flickering torch, who saw and heard many things that the other gods did not, who moved through the night like a whisper and gathered secrets the way a spider gathers flies. I heard her voice, Hecate told Demeter. I heard her cry out. I was in my cave and the sound reached me through the stone. She called for you. She called for her mother, but I did not see who took her. I did not see from which direction the voice came. I only heard the cry, and then silence. It was not much, this scrap of information, but it was enough to confirm what Demeter had feared. Cora had not wandered off. Cora had been taken. Taken by force, taken against her will, taken by someone powerful enough to seize the daughter of two Olympian gods and vanish with her into thin air. Together, Demeter and Hecate went to the one being who saw everything that happened upon the face of the earth, the one witness from whom nothing could be hidden. They went to Helios, the sun god, he who drove his golden chariot across the sky each day and looked down upon the world with eyes that missed no detail, no matter how small. Helios was reluctant to speak. He knew what he had seen, and he knew that the telling of it would bring a storm of grief and rage that even his bright presence could not withstand. But Demeter stood before him with her torches still burning in her hands, her face haggard, her golden hair tangled and matted, her divine beauty ravaged by 9 days of ceaseless anguish, and she begged him. She, the great goddess of the harvest, the gentle mother of the growing world, stood before the sun god and begged him, like a mortal beggar in the street. And even Helios, who had watched the world from his lofty height for countless aeons, and had learned to view the sufferings of gods and mortals alike with a certain detached equanimity, was moved. And so he told her. He told her everything. He told her that Hades, lord of the dead, had risen from the underworld in his black chariot and seized Kore from the meadow of Nysa. He told her that Zeus himself had given his consent, had sanctioned the abduction, had arranged for the divine Narcissus to be planted as a lure. He told her that her daughter was now in the underworld, in the palace of Hades, and that the Lord of the Dead intended to make her his wife and queen. Helios spoke gently, even kindly, for he was not a cruel god, and when he had finished, he added words meant to comfort, though they brought no comfort at all. He told Demeter that Hades was not unworthy as a husband, that he was a great and powerful god, ruler of a vast realm, brother of Zeus himself. He told her that the match was not dishonorable, that many would consider it a great privilege for their daughter to sit upon the throne of the underworld. But Demeter heard none of this. She heard only the essential, devastating fact. Her daughter had been stolen. Stolen by the god of the dead, with the full knowledge and approval of the girl's own father. The two most powerful gods in the cosmos had conspired against her, had taken the thing she loved most in all the world, and had given her no voice, no choice, no chance to intervene. Something changed in Demeter then, something fundamental, something irreversible. The grief that had consumed her for 9 days did not disappear, but it was joined now by something harder, something colder, something that burned not with the frantic heat of panic, but with the slow, relentless intensity of a fire that will not be extinguished until it has consumed everything in its path. It was rage. Demeter's rage was not the spectacular, thunderbolt-hurling rage of Zeus, not the earthquake-causing fury of Poseidon. It was quieter than that, deeper than that, and in the end, far more devastating. It was the rage of a mother betrayed, and it was bottomless. She extinguished her torches. She tore the wreath of grain from her hair. She cast aside her divine garments and clothed herself in the dark robes of mourning. And she turned her back on Olympus, turned her back on the gods who had betrayed her, turned her back on the whole bright world of the immortals, and she descended to the earth, not as a goddess, as an old woman, bent and grey and nameless, with grief etched into every line of her face, and a cold fury burning behind her dim and weary eyes. And behind her, unnoticed, the first flower wilted. The first leaf turned brown. The first field of grain began, almost imperceptibly, to dry and wither in the still warm sun. The world did not know it yet, but the eternal spring was over. The old woman of Eleusis, disguised as a mortal crone, Demeter, wandered the earth. She walked with slow, heavy steps along dusty roads that wound through villages and across plains, past farms and olive groves and little towns built of rough stone and sun-dried clay. She walked as mortals walk, feeling the stones beneath her feet, feeling the heat of the sun on her covered head, feeling the weight of years she had never actually lived pressing down upon her shoulders like a cloak of lead. She spoke to no one. She ate nothing. She drank nothing save the cool water from roadside springs, and even that she tasted without pleasure, for pleasure was a thing that had been taken from her along with her daughter, and she could not imagine ever knowing it again. She was a hollow thing now, a shell of grief walking through a world that seemed flat and colorless and utterly without meaning. The mortals she passed on the road saw only what the disguise allowed them to see. An old woman, poor and alone, perhaps a widow, perhaps a refugee from some distant war or famine, one of the countless displaced and dispossessed who wandered the ancient world in search of shelter and kindness. Some looked upon her with pity, some looked away. A few, remembering the sacred laws of hospitality that Zeus himself had decreed, offered her bread or water or a place to rest. She refused them all with a silent shake of her head and walked on. She walked until she came to a place called Eleusis. It was a small town then, unremarkable, nestled in a gentle valley near the coast. There was a well there, a stone-rimmed well that stood in the shade of an old olive tree just outside the town walls, and Demeter sat down beside it, with the heaviness of one who has traveled a very long way and has nowhere left to go. She sat in the shade and leaned her back against the cool stone and closed her eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, the mask of mortal old age slipped, and anyone who had been watching might have glimpsed, behind the wrinkled face and the dim eyes, something vast and luminous, and terribly, terribly sad. It was there, beside that well, that the daughters of Celeus found her. Celeus was the king of Eleusis, though king was perhaps too grand a word for the ruler of so small a town. He was a good man, respected by his people, known for his fairness and his piety, and the warmth of his household. He had 4 daughters, young women of grace and good nature, and they had come to the well that afternoon to draw water for their family's evening meal. They saw the old woman sitting alone in the shade, and because they had been raised by good parents in a home where the laws of hospitality were honored, they stopped and spoke to her. "Who are you, grandmother?" they asked gently. "Where do you come from? Why do you sit here alone?" And Demeter, looking up at these kind young faces, these daughters who reminded her, with a pain that was almost physical, of the daughter she had lost, told them a story. Not the truth, for the truth was too vast and too terrible for mortal ears, but a plausible fiction that explained her presence without revealing her nature. She told them that her name was Doso, that she was from the island of Crete, that she had been captured by pirates and had escaped when their ship made landfall, and that she was now wandering in search of work, any honest work that might give her shelter and purpose. The daughters of Celeus listened with compassion and told her that their mother, Metanera, had recently given birth to a son, a late-born child, a boy named Demophon, and that the household was in need of a nurse for the infant. Would the old woman consider such a position? It would give her a roof over her head, food to eat, and the company of a good family. Demeter agreed, not because she wanted comfort, not because she sought companionship, but because the mention of a newborn child had stirred something in the depths of her frozen heart, some faint echo of the maternal love that was the core of her being, and she found that she could not turn away from it. And so the daughters led her through the gates of Eleusis and into the house of Seleucus, and there she met Metanera, the queen, a woman of middle years with a kind face and tired eyes, who held in her arms the infant Demophon, a plump and rosy baby who gazed up at the old woman with wide, curious eyes and reached for her with tiny, grasping hands. Something softened in Demeter when she took the child. She held him carefully, this small mortal creature, so fragile, so temporary, so utterly unlike the divine daughter she had lost, and yet so full of that same mysterious spark of life that she had spent her existence nurturing and protecting. The baby settled into her arms as if he had always belonged there, and he closed his eyes and slept, and Demeter held him and listened to his breathing and felt, for the first time in many days, something other than the cold ache of grief. Metanera, watching this, was reassured. There was something about the old woman, something she could not quite name, a quality of presence, of depth, of quiet authority that seemed out of place in a wandering beggar. She seemed more than she appeared, this Doso, though Metanera could not have said precisely how. But the baby was content in her arms, and that was enough. The position was offered, and it was accepted. And the old woman, who was really the goddess of the harvest, took up residence in the house of a mortal king and began to care for his son. The household was kind to her. They gave her a place to sleep, a simple room near the nursery. They gave her food and drink, though she ate little and drank less. They included her in the family's daily life, in the meals and the conversations and the small domestic rituals that made up the pattern of their days. And Demeter endured it all with a patience that was not quite peace, allowed herself to be drawn, slowly and reluctantly, into the warmth of this mortal family, even as the cold fire of her rage continued to burn in the hidden places of her heart. But it was the child who truly claimed her attention. Little Demephon, innocent and unknowing, became the focus of what remained of Demeter's capacity for love. She cared for him with a devotion that went far beyond the duties of a hired nurse. She held him for hours, singing to him in a low, sweet voice that made the air in the nursery shimmer. She bathed him in water infused with herbs, whose names and properties were known only to the gods. She rubbed his small body with ambrosia, the divine substance that sustained the immortals, and the child thrived under her care, growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing day, growing in a way that surprised and delighted his parents, who marveled at their son's extraordinary vitality, and gave thanks to the gods for sending them such a remarkable nurse. But Demeter was doing more than simply caring for the child. She was doing something that only a goddess of her power could do, something that Metanera and Celeus could not have imagined in their most extraordinary dreams. She was making Demophon immortal. Each night, when the household slept and the lamps burned low, Demeter took the infant to the great hearth at the center of the house, where the fire burned constantly, day and night as was the custom of the time. And there, holding the baby with infinite tenderness, she laid him among the embers, not to burn him, never to burn him. The fire did not touch him, could not touch him, for Demeter's power shielded him completely, wrapping him in a cocoon of divine protection that turned the flames into something nourishing rather than destructive. The fire burned away his mortality instead, slowly, night by night, consuming the fragile, temporary elements of his human nature and replacing them with something stronger, something lasting, something divine. It was a gift beyond measure, this thing Demeter was doing, a gift born of her grief and her love, her desperate need to protect at least one child, even if she could not protect her own. Night after night she performed this secret ritual, and night after night the child grew stronger, more radiant, more alive. His eyes began to shine with an unusual light. His skin took on a golden glow. He laughed more often and more easily, and his laughter had a quality that made everyone who heard it feel, for just a moment, that the world was a kinder and more beautiful place than they had believed. He was almost there, almost transformed, almost lifted beyond the reach of death and time and all the sorrows that plagued the mortal condition. A few more nights, and the work would be complete, and one small human child would have been granted the gift of eternal life by a goddess who had nothing left to give, except her power and her broken love. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. The revelation at Eleusis. It happened on a night when the moon was dark, and the stars were hidden behind a veil of thin cloud. Demeter had taken the sleeping Demophon from his cradle, as she did every night, and carried him silently to the darkened house, to the great hearth. The fire burned low but steady, its embers glowing like a bed of rubies, casting a warm, flickering light across the stone floor and the rough walls, and the face of the goddess who knelt beside it with the infant in her arms She was just lowering the child into the embers, her lips moving in the ancient words of the divine incantation that shielded him from harm, when a sound broke the silence. A gasp, sharp and involuntary, the sound of a breath drawn in sudden, overwhelming horror, and then a scream. Metanera stood in the doorway. She had come to check on her son, drawn by some nameless maternal anxiety, some restless worry that had pulled her from sleep and sent her padding through the quiet house to the nursery, where she had found the cradle empty. She had followed the faint glow of the hearth fire to the central hall, and there she had seen something that froze the blood in her veins and turned her heart to ice. She saw her baby in the fire. That was all she could see, all her mortal eyes could comprehend. She could not see the divine protection that surrounded the child like a second skin. She could not see the careful, loving purpose behind the act. She saw only her infant son lying among the glowing coals, and her scream tore through the house like a blade, waking the servants, waking the other children, shattering the silence of the night with the raw, animal terror of a mother who believes her child is dying. She lunged forward, reaching for Demephon with desperate hands, but she never reached him. Demeter turned, and in turning, the disguise fell away. Not slowly, not piece by piece, but all at once like a garment dropped to the floor. The old woman was gone. In her place stood a goddess, tall and terrible and radiant with a light that was not warm but blinding. A cold, furious light that filled the room and sent Metanera staggering backward with her hands raised to shield her eyes. Demeter lifted the child from the fire and held him close, and the baby, disturbed by the noise and the sudden brightness, began to cry. The sound of his crying seemed to soften the goddess just slightly, and when she spoke, her voice, though it trembled with barely contained fury, was not without compassion. "Foolish woman," she said, and the words fell like stones into the stunned silence. "You could not understand, and because you could not understand, you have destroyed the gift I was giving. I was burning away his mortality. I was making your son a god. He would have lived forever, free from age, free from sickness, free from death. But your fear has broken the ritual, and it cannot be completed. Your son will live and die as all mortals live and die, and the immortality that was within his grasp has been lost." She placed the crying infant on the ground, gently, and straightened to her full height, and her full height was something that the room could barely contain. Her head brushed the ceiling beams. Her golden hair, no longer gray and tangled but shining with divine radiance, flowed down her back like a river of light. Her eyes blazed with a fire that was not the fire of the hearth, but something far older and far more dangerous. The fire of a goddess wronged, a mother betrayed, a power that had been constrained too long and was now breaking free. "I am Demeter," she said, and the name rolled through the house like thunder. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, mother of Kore, she who makes the grain grow and the fields flourish, she without whom the earth is barren and the bellies of mortals are empty. I came to your house in disguise, and you showed me kindness, and for that kindness I would have given your son the greatest gift any mortal has ever received. But that gift is beyond your reach now, lost to your fear and your ignorance." Metanera fell to her knees, trembling, weeping, unable to speak. The servants who had gathered in the doorway fell likewise, pressing their faces to the floor, overwhelmed by the divine presence that filled the room with light and power, and the sweet, heavy fragrance of ripe grain. Even the baby had stopped crying and lay silent on the ground, gazing up at the goddess with wide, unblinking eyes. Demeter looked down at them, these fragile mortals, these brief and trembling creatures, and something of the anger went out of her, replaced by a weariness so vast and so deep that it seemed to encompass not just her own suffering, but the suffering of every mother who had ever lost a child, mortal or divine, since the beginning of time. But she was not finished with Eleusis. Even in her grief, even in her rage, Demeter's mind worked with the long, deliberate purpose of an immortal who sees not just the present moment, but the vast sweep of time that stretches out before and behind it. She had come to Eleusis for reasons that went beyond the chance kindness of a king's daughters at a well. She had come because this place, this small and unremarkable town, was to play a role in something larger, something that would endure long after Celius and Metanera and all their children had turned to dust. "Build me a temple," she commanded. "Build it on the hill above the town, a great temple with a deep altar, and there I will teach you rites and mysteries that will bring you closer to the gods than any mortal has ever been. These mysteries will be my gift to you, in place of the immortality your queen's fear has cost your son. They will not make you gods, but they will show you something of what lies beyond the veil of death, and those who are initiated into them will face their mortal end not with terror, but with understanding and with hope." The mortals of Eleusis obeyed. Of course they obeyed. They had seen the face of the goddess, had felt the weight of her presence, and they knew that to disobey would be to invite a destruction beyond anything they could imagine. They built the temple quickly, working day and night, raising walls of stone and columns of carved wood on the hill above their town. And when it was finished, Demeter entered it and closed the great doors behind her and sat down in the darkness within. And there she stayed, alone, silent, wrapped in her dark robes of mourning, her face hidden, her hands empty, her heart a wasteland of grief and rage that no prayer could reach and no offering could soften. She sat in her temple, and she refused to do the one thing that only she could do. She refused to let the earth bear fruit. She would not bless the fields. She would not call the seeds from the soil. She would not send the rain or warm the ground or do any of the thousand small essential things that her divine power accomplished each day to keep the world alive and fed and fruitful. She withdrew her gifts from the earth entirely, absolutely without exception and without mercy. And the earth, deprived of its goddess, began to die. This was the beginning of what mortals would later call the first winter, though it was not truly winter as the world would come to know it. It was something far worse than winter. It was an ending, a slow, terrible, deliberate ending, imposed upon the world by a mother whose child had been stolen, and who had decided with the cold and implacable logic of absolute despair that if her daughter could not live in the light, then nothing would, the world without spring. And so the famine came, not swiftly, not with the dramatic suddenness of a flood or an earthquake, but slowly, insidiously, like a disease that creeps through the body cell by cell, draining the vitality from each organ in turn until the whole system begins, quietly and irreversibly, to fail. It began with the flowers. They were the first to go, the most delicate, the most dependent on the subtle infusions of divine energy that Demeter had always provided without thought, as naturally as breathing. One morning the roses did not open. The next day the crocuses drooped and turned brown. Within a week, every flower in every field and garden across the whole wide world had withered and died, their petals falling to the ground like tears, their stems collapsing into the dry, cracked earth from which they had sprung. Then the grass began to yellow, the leaves began to curl and fall. The orchards, those beautiful orchards that Demeter had tended with such pride and such joy, stood skeletal and bare against a sky that seemed to grow paler and colder with each passing day. The vines that had hung heavy with grapes shriveled on their supports. The olive trees, ancient and resilient, clung to life longer than most, but even they succumbed eventually, their silver-green leaves turning dull and gray and dropping one by one until the twisted trunks stood naked and forlorn, like old men stripped of their dignity and left to face the cold alone. The grain died last because it was the hardiest, the most deeply rooted, the crop most intimately connected to Demeter herself. But even the grain could not survive the total withdrawal of its goddess's favor. The wheat that had stood tall and golden in the fields turned pale, then white, then gray, and finally collapsed into the dust, leaving nothing but stubble and silence where there had once been abundance and life. The mortals at first were merely confused. A bad season, they told themselves, a drought, perhaps. The gods were displeased about something. They would make offerings, say prayers, perform the proper rituals, and the earth would recover. It always had before. But the earth did not recover. The offerings went unacknowledged. The prayers echoed into empty silence. The rituals performed with increasing desperation by priests and priestesses, who could feel the divine absence as clearly as a sailor feels the absence of wind accomplished nothing. The earth remained barren, and the granaries, once full, began to empty. Hunger came first to the poorest. It always does. The farmers who lived on the margins, who relied on each year's harvest to carry them through to the next, found their stores exhausted within weeks. They slaughtered their livestock, but the animals too were starving, their flesh thin and stringy, barely enough to sustain a family for a few days. They foraged for roots and bark and the bitter, woody plants that grew in the cracks of rocks and the margins of streams. They ate things that no human should have to eat, things that filled the stomach but provided no nourishment, and their children grew thin and hollow-eyed and quiet with the terrible, unnatural quietness of children who have learned that crying will not bring food. Then hunger came for the rest, for the merchants and the craftsmen, the soldiers and the scholars, the priests and the nobles, and even the kings. No one was spared. No wealth could buy what did not exist. No power could command the earth to yield what it had been forbidden to yield. The great cities, those proud centers of civilization that had risen on the surplus of abundant harvests, began to falter and crack. Markets stood empty. Temples fell silent. The streets that had hummed with commerce and conversation grew quiet, populated only by the gaunt and shuffling figures of the hungry, who wandered without purpose and without hope, searching for sustenance that was not there. And still Demeter sat in her temple at Eleusis, alone in the darkness, and would not relent. She knew what was happening. She felt it. Every withered stalk, every dying tree, every hungry child. She felt it all, for the earth was still her body, still her domain, still connected to her by bonds that even her rage could not sever. The suffering of the world flowed into her like a dark river, adding its weight to the grief she already carried. And it was terrible, it was agonizing, but it was not enough to make her yield. Nothing would be enough. Not until she had her daughter back. The other gods watched from Olympus with growing alarm. At first, they had been content to look the other way, to treat the matter as a private dispute between Demeter and Zeus, a family quarrel that would resolve itself in time. But as the famine deepened, and the prayers of mortals grew more desperate and more numerous, even the most self-absorbed Olympians began to realize that this was not a passing storm. This was a catastrophe, and it was getting worse. For the gods too depended on mortals, though they were reluctant to admit it. It was the prayers and offerings of humankind that sustained divine power, that fed the sacred fires in the temples, that kept alive the faith and devotion upon which the gods' very existence, in some mysterious and essential way, depended. Without mortals, there would be no worship. Without worship, the gods would diminish, would fade, would become mere echoes of themselves, powerless and forgotten. The famine threatened not just humanity, but the entire divine order, and even the most callous among the Olympians could see that something had to be done. Zeus sent messengers. He sent Iris, the rainbow goddess, his faithful herald, to the temple at Eleusis, with gifts and promises and appeals to reason. Demeter refused to see her. He sent other gods, one after another, each bearing richer gifts, each speaking with greater eloquence, each attempting to persuade the grieving goddess to lift the curse she had laid upon the earth. She refused them all. She would not listen. She would not negotiate. She would not accept any offer, any compromise, any arrangement that did not include the one thing she demanded. "Give me back my daughter," she said, and her voice, even diminished by grief, even roughened by days of silence, carried a weight that made the walls of the temple tremble. "Give me back my daughter, and the earth will live again. Keep her from me, and the earth will die, and all who depend upon it, mortal and immortal alike, will die with it." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of one who has nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear. Demeter had found, in the depths of her despair, a weapon more powerful than any thunderbolt, more devastating than any earthquake. She had found the weapon of absolute refusal, and she wielded it with the relentless, unyielding determination of a mother who will accept nothing less than the return of her child. Zeus, for once in his long and turbulent reign, found himself at a loss. He could not force Demeter to relent. Even his thunderbolt, the most powerful weapon in the cosmos, could not compel a goddess to exercise her divine gift against her will. He could not ignore the crisis, for the famine was now so severe that humanity itself was on the brink of extinction, and with it, the worship and sacrifice that sustained the gods. And he could not simply return Kore from the underworld, for he had given his word to Hades, and even Zeus, faithless as he was in so many things, understood that a bargain between the three great brothers was not something that could be casually broken. He was trapped between his brother's desire and his sister's grief, between the needs of the dead and the needs of the living, between the promise he had made in the golden throne room of Olympus and the devastation that promise had unleashed upon the world. For perhaps the first time in his existence, the king of the gods did not know what to do, but he knew that something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. The earth could not endure much more. The last reserves of stored grain were nearly exhausted. The last animals were dying. The streams were running dry. Even the seas were growing strange and still, as if the withdrawal of Demeter's power was affecting not just the land, but the water and the air, and the very fabric of the natural world. A few more weeks, perhaps a few more days, and there would be nothing left. The world would be a dead rock spinning in the void, and the great experiment of life, mortal and divine alike, would be over. And so Zeus made his decision. He would send to the underworld. He would send someone to bring Kore back, the Queen of Shadows, while the world above withered and starved, while her mother wandered in anguish, and the gods of Olympus quarreled and deliberated. Persephone sat in the palace of the dead and tried to understand what had become of her life. The underworld was nothing like anything she had imagined, on those rare occasions when she had imagined it at all. As a child of the sunlit earth, raised among flowers and birdsong, and the warm golden light of an endless spring, she had given little thought to the realm beneath her feet. It was a place for the dead, a shadowy, formless region of endings and silence, and it had no place in the bright, busy world of a young goddess who was concerned only with the living and the growing and the beautiful. But now she was here, and it was her home, and she was discovering that the underworld, like so many things, was far more complex and far more strange than the simple stories told about it. The palace of Hades was vast. It stretched through caverns so enormous that their ceilings were lost in darkness, their walls so distant that they seemed like the walls of the world itself. It was built of black stone, obsidian, and basalt, and dark marble veined with silver, and its halls were lit not by sunlight or firelight, but by a cold, pale luminescence that seemed to emanate from the stone itself, a ghost light steady and unchanging that cast no shadows and offered no warmth. There were rooms beyond counting, chambers and corridors and galleries that seemed to go on forever, each one filled with treasures drawn from the deep places of the earth. Gold in great gleaming rivers, silver in cascading sheets, gemstones of every color and kind, diamonds and rubies and emeralds and sapphires, heaped in careless abundance on shelves and tables and floors, their facets catching the pale light and throwing it back in tiny, cold sparks that were beautiful, but somehow sad, like stars reflected in the eyes of the dead. And the dead were everywhere. They moved through the halls and corridors of the palace like whispers, like memories, like faint pencil sketches of the vivid, full-color beings they had once been. They were the shades, the spirits of mortals who had lived and loved and suffered and died, and who now existed in this twilight state, neither alive nor truly gone, preserved in a dim half-existence that was not painful, but was not joyful either. They did not speak, for the most part. They did not eat or drink or sleep. They simply drifted slowly and aimlessly through the endless corridors of the underworld, and if they remembered the sunlit world they had left behind, they gave no sign of it. Persephone found them heartbreaking, these faded, silent beings who had once been mothers and fathers, children and lovers, warriors and poets and farmers and kings. They had lived full lives above, had known the warmth of the sun and the taste of fresh bread, and the sound of laughter and the touch of those they loved, and now they were reduced to this, shadows of shadows, echoes of echoes, moving through eternity in a state of gentle, passionless oblivion. She wept for them. In those early days in the underworld, she wept often, though her tears brought no comfort and no change. She wept for the dead, and she wept for herself, and she wept for the sunlit world she had lost, and the mother she missed with an aching physical longing that never diminished and never grew easier to bear. She refused to eat, refused to drink, refused to sit upon the great dark throne that Hades had placed beside his own. She sat instead in a corner of the vast bedchamber that had been prepared for her, a room hung with tapestries of black and silver, and furnished with every luxury the underworld could provide. And she wept and she waited, and she called silently, ceaselessly, for her mother. Hades, for his part, did not know what to do with her grief. He had expected resistance, he had expected anger, he had even expected hatred, at least initially. What he had not expected was this bottomless, inconsolable sorrow that seemed to flow from her like water from a spring, that filled the halls of his palace with a sadness so palpable that even the dead seemed to feel it, their dim figures pausing in their endless wandering to turn their faded faces toward the sound of her weeping. He tried to comfort her in his clumsy, earnest way. He brought her gifts, the finest jewels from his treasury, diamonds that burned with cold fire, rubies the color of heart's blood, a necklace of black pearls so perfect that each one seemed to contain within it a tiny captured night sky. She did not look at them. He brought her flowers, or what passed for flowers in the underworld, strange pale blooms that grew without sunlight in the crevices of underground rivers, ghostly and beautiful in their own way, but nothing like the vivid, fragrant blossoms of the world above. She turned her face away. He spoke to her gently, this dark and awkward god who had spent so long in silence that the art of conversation had grown rusty and strange in his mouth. He told her about his kingdom, about its wonders and its mysteries, about the great rivers that flowed through the underworld, each one with its own nature and its own power. The Styx, river of hatred, upon whose waters even the gods swore their most sacred oaths. The Acheron, river of woe, across which the newly dead were ferried by old Charon in his creaking boat. The Lethe, river of forgetfulness, whose waters could wash away all memory, all pain, all longing for the life that had been left behind. The Phlegethon, river of fire, whose flames burned eternally without consuming. And the Cocytus, river of lamentation, whose waters were made entirely of the tears of the sorrowful dead. He told her about the Elysian fields, that blessed region of the underworld where the souls of the truly good and the truly heroic spent their afterlife in a state of perpetual happiness, wandering through meadows of pale, luminous grass beneath a sky that was not quite sky but a soft, diffused light that resembled, faintly and hauntingly, the glow of a sun remembered in a dream. He told her that she would be his queen, his partner, his equal in all things, that she would rule beside him, not beneath him, that the dead needed not only a king but a queen, a feminine presence, a voice of compassion and gentleness to balance his own stern justice. He told her that she would find purpose here, meaning here, a role that was not lesser, but different from the one she had known above. He told her these things with a sincerity that was awkward and touching, and utterly, hopelessly inadequate to the enormity of what he had done. And slowly, very slowly, something began to change. Not forgiveness. Persephone did not forgive Hades, not then, perhaps not ever entirely, but the first sharp edge of her terror dulled, worn down by the days that passed in that timeless, changeless place where there was no sun to mark the hours and no moon to mark the nights. And as the terror receded, she began, almost against her will, to truly see the world she had been brought to, not through the lens of grief and fear, but with the clear, curious eyes that had always been her truest gift. She saw that the underworld, for all its darkness, was not without its own austere beauty. The caverns through which the underground rivers flowed were cathedrals of natural stone, their walls carved by millennia of patient water into shapes of breathtaking complexity and grace. Crystals grew in clusters from the ceilings, catching the pale light and fragmenting it into tiny rainbows that danced across the dark stone like shy, hesitant spirits. There were gardens of stone, forests of stalagmites that rose from the cavern floors like frozen trees, their surfaces smooth and cool and strangely comforting to the touch. And she saw that Hades himself, this grim and lonely god who had stolen her from the sunlight, was not the monster she had first believed him to be. He was solemn, yes, and stern and burdened by a weight of responsibility that showed in every line of his pale face and every measured word he spoke. But he was also patient. He was also kind, in his stiff and unpracticed way. He did not force himself upon her. He did not command or threaten or demand. He simply waited, with the infinite patience of one accustomed to the slow, deep rhythms of eternity, and hoped. She did not love him, not yet, perhaps not ever, in the bright, uncomplicated way she had loved the sunlit world above. But she began, cautiously, tentatively, like a flower opening in uncertain light, to see him not as her captor but as a fellow being, lonely and flawed and yearning for connection, trapped in a role he had not chosen and a kingdom he could not leave. It was not enough. It was not happiness. But it was a beginning. The messenger of the gods. On Olympus, Zeus had made his decision, and he did not delay in acting upon it. For all his faults, and they were many and legendary, Zeus possessed the ability to move with decisive speed when the situation demanded it, and the situation demanded it with an urgency that could no longer be ignored. The earth was dying. Humanity was on the brink of collapse. The temples stood empty, the altars cold, the sacred fires untended, and the gods could feel their own power dimming like lamps running low on oil. He summoned Hermes. Of all the gods of Olympus, Hermes was perhaps the most uniquely suited to the task at hand. He was the messenger of the gods. Yes, the swift-footed son of Zeus who carried the commands of heaven to every corner of the cosmos. But he was more than that. Hermes was the god of boundaries and the crossing of boundaries, the divine intermediary who moved freely between worlds that no other god could bridge. He traveled between Olympus and the earth, between the earth and the underworld, between the world of the living and the world of the dead, with an ease and a fearlessness that no other god possessed. He was the psychopomp, the guide of souls, the one who led the newly dead down the dark paths to Hades' kingdom, and he was therefore known in the underworld, respected there, granted passage through its gates and corridors without challenge or hindrance. He was also clever, cleverer perhaps than any other god, including Zeus himself, though he had the wisdom never to say so aloud. Hermes possessed a quicksilver intelligence, a gift for diplomacy and persuasion, a talent for finding solutions where others saw only impasse. He could charm the most hostile audience, negotiate the most impossible bargain, and navigate the most treacherous political waters with a grace and a lightness that made the most complex tasks look effortless. Zeus told him what needed to be done. Go to the underworld, he said. Go to my brother Hades, and tell him that I command him to release Kore, daughter of Demeter, and allow her to return to the surface world. Tell him that the earth is dying, that humanity is perishing, that the order of the cosmos itself is threatened by Demeter's grief. Tell him that the girl must be returned to her mother, or all that we have built, all that we are, will crumble to dust and darkness. Hermes listened, nodded, and set out without delay. He fastened his golden sandals, the winged sandals that allowed him to fly faster than thought, and he took up his caduceus, the staff entwined with two serpents that was the symbol of his office and his power, and he left the bright halls of Olympus and descended into the earth. Down he went, through the cracks and crevices, through the winding passages that led from the upper world to the lower, through darkness that deepened with each step until it was absolute, a darkness so complete that it seemed not merely the absence of light, but a positive, tangible presence, a thing with weight and texture, and a cold mineral smell. Down past the roots of mountains, past underground rivers that flowed in silence through caverns no mortal eye had ever seen, past veins of gold and silver that gleamed briefly in the light of his passing, and then vanished back into the dark. And finally, at the bottom of the world, he came to the gates of the underworld. They were enormous, those gates, built of bronze so thick and so heavy that no force in the mortal world could have moved them. They stood between pillars of black stone, and before them sat Cerberus, the three-headed dog, the monstrous guardian whose duty was to ensure that the dead who entered never left, and that the living who approached turned back or perished. But Cerberus knew Hermes. The great beast lowered its three massive heads and allowed the god to pass, as it always did, for Hermes was one of the few beings in all the cosmos who could enter and leave the underworld freely, a privilege born of his role as guide of the dead, and acknowledged by even the most fearsome guardians of the netherworld. Through the gates and into the kingdom of the dead Hermes walked, his golden sandals making no sound on the dark stone floor, his caduceus casting a faint warm glow that pushed back the shadows and drew the attention of the drifting shades, who turned their pale hollow faces toward the light with expressions of dim wonder, as if remembering, faintly and from a great distance, what it had been like to be warm. He passed through the fields of asphodel, where the ordinary dead wandered in their endless, purposeless drift. He passed the great crossroads where the three judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, sat upon their thrones of dark stone and weighed the souls of the recently departed, assigning each to its proper place in the vast geography of the afterlife. He passed the entrance to Tartarus, that dreadful pit of punishment, where the worst of the worst endured torments beyond imagining, and he could hear faintly the distant sounds of suffering that rose from its depths like heat from a furnace. And at last he came to the palace of Hades, that great dark edifice of obsidian and basalt that rose from the floor of the largest cavern in the underworld, like a mountain carved by deliberate hands. Its towers were lost in the darkness overhead. Its gates were guarded by spirits of such grim and ancient power that even Hermes, bold as he was, felt a momentary chill as he passed between them. He found Hades in the throne room, seated upon his great chair of black stone with its carvings of bones and sleeping figures, and beside him, on a smaller throne, sat Persephone. She was pale, Hermes noted, paler than she had been in the sunlit world above, and thinner, and there were shadows beneath her green eyes that had not been there before. But she was alive, and she was alert, and when she saw Hermes enter the hall with his golden sandals, and his glowing staff and his quick bright eyes, something flickered in her face. Recognition, memory, a sudden, sharp awareness of the world she had lost, triggered by the presence of a god from that world, a visitor from the land of light and air and living things. Hermes delivered his message with the diplomatic skill for which he was famous. He spoke respectfully to Hades, acknowledging the dark god's power and his rights, but making clear the gravity of the situation above. The earth was dying, he said. Humanity was on the brink of extinction. Demeter would not relent until her daughter was returned. Zeus himself, king of the gods and brother of Hades, commanded that Persephone be released. The word commanded hung in the air for a long moment. Hades was not a god accustomed to being commanded. In his own realm, his authority was absolute, unchallenged even by Zeus himself, for the division of the cosmos had given each brother sovereignty over his own domain, and the underworld was Hades' domain, as surely as the sky belonged to Zeus and the sea to Poseidon. But Hades was also not a fool. He understood the implications of what Hermes was telling him. He understood that the famine above threatened the entire order of the cosmos, that a dead world served no one, not the gods, not the mortals, not even the Lord of the dead himself. For without mortals to die, the underworld would receive no new subjects, and his kingdom, vast as it was, would slowly, imperceptibly diminish. And there was something else, something that Hades would not have admitted to anyone, perhaps not even to himself. In the time that Persephone had spent in his kingdom, he had come to see with a clarity that was painful and unavoidable, that a love taken by force is not truly love at all. She was there, yes. She sat beside him on her throne, and she no longer wept constantly, and she had even begun to speak to him, cautiously, carefully, in words that were not warm but were no longer cold. But she was not happy, she was not free, and the happiness he had hoped to find in her presence was poisoned at its root by the knowledge that she had not chosen to be there. Hades looked at Persephone. She looked back at him, and in that look, something passed between them, something wordless and complex. something that was not love and not hatred, but something in between, something that acknowledged the strange, painful intimacy of captor and captive who have spent long enough together to become, despite everything, known to each other. Very well, said Hades. She may go. The seeds of fate. She may go. The words fell into the silence of the throne room, like stones dropped into deep water, and the ripples spread outward, touching everything. Hermes exhaled, a small breath of relief that he quickly masked beneath his customary composure. Persephone stiffened on her throne, her green eyes widening, her hands gripping the cold stone armrests, as if she feared that the slightest movement might cause the dark god to change his mind. Hades sat very still. His face, always pale, always stern, betrayed nothing of what was happening behind those dark, fathomless eyes. He had made his decision, and he would not unmake it. For Hades, whatever else he was a god who kept his word once it was given. But the decision cost him something. It cost him dearly. Anyone who looked closely might have seen it. A faint tightening around the mouth, a barely perceptible dimming of the already dim light in his eyes. The infinitesimal contraction of a heart that had opened briefly and painfully to the possibility of companionship and was now closing again around the familiar ache of solitude. But before you leave, he said, turning to Persephone, and his voice was quiet and careful, like a man choosing his way across uncertain ground. Let me offer you something. Not a command, not a trick, simply a gift. You have eaten nothing since you came to my kingdom. You have refused every dish, every cup, every morsel that has been placed before you. And I would not have you leave my house hungry. For whatever else may be said of me, it shall not be said that the Lord of the dead let his guests depart without sustenance. He raised his hand, and a servant appeared from the shadows, carrying a silver plate. Upon the plate lay a single fruit, a pomegranate, its leathery skin a deep rich red, the color of garnets, the color of old wine, the color of blood and rubies, and the last light of a dying sunset. It was ripe and full, heavy with juice, and when Hades took it and split it open with his hands, the interior gleamed with seeds, hundreds of them, each one a tiny jewel of translucent crimson, each one glistening with sweet dark juice. Here, he said, and held it out to her. Eat. Just a little. Just enough to remember that not everything in this dark kingdom was bitter. Persephone looked at the pomegranate. She looked at Hades. She looked at Hermes, who stood by the door with his golden sandals and his serpent staff, ready to lead her back to the surface, back to the light, back to her mother and the world she had been torn from. She was so close to freedom, so close to the end of this long, dark ordeal. Every instinct told her to refuse, to turn away, to take nothing from this place, to leave it as completely and as finally as possible. But she was hungry. She was so very hungry. The long days and nights without food had taken their toll even on her divine constitution, and the pomegranate gleamed in the pale light with a beauty that was almost impossible to resist. The seeds shone like tiny red stars, and their fragrance, sweet and sharp and faintly metallic, rose to her nostrils and awoke in her a hunger that was not just physical, but something deeper, something that had to do with all the days of deprivation and all the nights of sorrow, something that craved not just food, but the simple primal comfort of taste and sustenance, and the reassurance that she was still alive, still capable of feeling, still connected to the physical world. She reached out. She took the pomegranate from his hands, and she ate. Not much, not the whole fruit, not even a significant portion of it. She lifted the broken half to her lips and ate only a few seeds, separating them from the white membrane with her fingers and placing them one by one upon her tongue. Some say she ate 4 seeds, some say 6, some say 7. The number would be debated by poets and scholars for millennia to come, for it mattered enormously, though Persephone could not have known it then. Each seed she swallowed was a bond, a chain, a link between herself and the underworld that could never be completely broken. For this was the ancient law, older than the gods themselves, older than Olympus, older than the Titans and the primordial chaos from which the world was born. Those who eat the food of the dead are bound to the dead. Those who taste the fruit of the underworld must return to the underworld. It is a law that cannot be appealed, cannot be overturned, cannot be broken by any force in the cosmos, not even by the will of Zeus himself. Did Hades know this when he offered her the fruit? The question has haunted the story since the beginning, and the answer remains, like so many things about the Lord of the Dead, shrouded in shadow. Perhaps he did. Perhaps it was his final, desperate stratagem, his last attempt to ensure that the woman he loved would not be lost to him entirely, that even if she returned to the surface, she would carry within her a piece of his kingdom, a connection to the darkness that would draw her back, again and again, for all eternity. Or perhaps he truly did not know, or did not think or acted out of genuine hospitality, the instinct of a host who could not bear to see a guest leave his table unfed. The truth, like Hades himself, remains in the dark. Persephone swallowed the seeds. She felt them go down, felt their sweet, sharp juice on her tongue, felt a warmth spread through her empty stomach that was comforting and strange and faintly unsettling, all at once. And then she set down the pomegranate, and she stood, and she looked at Hades with those green eyes that had seen so much in so short a time, had been forced to grow so far beyond the innocent. Flower-loving maiden who had danced in the meadow of Nysa a lifetime ago. "Thank you," she said, and the words were simple, and they might have meant anything, and Hades bowed his dark head and said nothing in reply. Hermes stepped forward then, gently, deft as always, his winged sandals barely whispering against the cold stone floor of the palace. He was the messenger, the guide between worlds, and he had come with the word of Zeus himself, that Persephone was to return to the surface, to the light, to her mother's arms. "Come," he said softly, "your mother waits." And Persephone looked once more at the halls of the underworld, at the pale flowers she had coaxed into bloom along the dark corridors, at the rivers that wound their slow silver way through the caverns, at the shades who drifted like mist through the endless twilight. She looked at Hades, who stood still and silent, his face unreadable, his dark eyes watching her with something that might have been sorrow, might have been acceptance, might have been love. And she turned, and she followed Hermes, and she did not look back again. The ascent was long. They moved through tunnels of black rock, through passages where the air grew warmer by slow degrees, where the silence of the deep gave way, little by little, to the faintest stirring of wind. Persephone felt the change in her bones before she felt it on her skin. A lightness, a lifting, as though the weight of all that darkness was peeling away from her, layer by layer, like the shedding of an old garment that no longer fit. And then there was light, not the cold silver light of the underworld, not the pale glow of phosphorescent stone, or the dim flicker of torches set in iron brackets along endless walls. This was sunlight, golden, warm, living sunlight, and it poured down through the mouth of the cave like water, like honey, like the first breath after a long, long drowning. Persephone stepped into it, and she closed her eyes, and she felt the warmth on her face, and she breathed, and the air smelled of earth and green things and rain, and she wept. She wept without sound, without shame, the tears running down her pale cheeks and catching the light like small bright jewels. And Hermes stood beside her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Demeter felt her daughter's return before she saw it. She had been wandering, as she had wandered for months now, across barren fields and frozen rivers, through villages where the hearths had gone cold and the granaries stood empty. The world had withered under the weight of her grief. The trees were bare, the soil was hard and cracked. No seed would sprout, no flower would bloom, no blade of grass would push its tender green head above the earth, because Demeter, goddess of the harvest, mother of all growing things, had turned her face away from the world and let it die. But now something stirred. She felt it like a pulse, like a heartbeat deep beneath the frozen ground, a warmth, a whisper, a thread of something golden and alive, pulling at her chest, pulling her forward, pulling her toward the south, toward a hillside she did not recognize, toward a cave she had never seen, toward a figure standing in the sunlight with her arms at her sides and her face turned up to the sky. Persephone. Demeter ran, she who had walked the earth in slow, heavy grief for all those long months. She ran, and Persephone saw her, and she ran too, and they met in the middle of that barren hillside, and they held each other, and the ground beneath their feet began to change. The grass came first, tender, bright, impossibly green. It pushed up through the cracks in the hard earth, spreading outward from the place where mother and daughter stood, as though their embrace was a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of life in every direction. Then the flowers came, crocuses and hyacinths and wild narcissus, the same flowers Persephone had been gathering on the day she was taken, and they bloomed in great joyful bursts of color, purple and gold and white, and the air filled with their scent, sweet and clean and achingly familiar. The trees put out new leaves, the rivers thawed and ran clear. Birds appeared from nowhere, filling the sky with song, and the wind turned warm, and the clouds parted, and the sun shone down on a world that was waking, slowly, beautifully, from the longest and most terrible sleep it had ever known. "My child," Demeter whispered, holding Persephone's face in her hands, looking at her as though she could not quite believe she was real. "My child, my child, my child." And Persephone smiled, and her smile was warm, but it was different now. It carried something in it that had not been there before, a depth, a knowing, a shadow of the dark place she had been, and the dark things she had seen. And Demeter saw it, and her heart ached, because she understood that the girl who had left was not the same as the woman who had returned. But the story was not yet over. For when the gods gathered on Olympus, when Zeus sat upon his throne of cloud and lightning and called the court to order, the matter of the pomegranate seeds was raised. 6 seeds, said Hermes, who had seen it, who had been there in the hall of Hades when Persephone had lifted the fruit to her lips. She ate 6 seeds of the pomegranate, and a silence fell over the hall of the gods, heavy and complete, because every immortal knew what that meant. The food of the dead was a bond that could not be broken, a chain stronger than iron, older than time. To eat in the underworld was to belong to it. That was the law, and not even Zeus could unmake it entirely. Demeter's face went white. "No," she said, and her voice was the voice of winter, the voice of famine, the voice of every field that would never bear fruit again if her daughter was taken from her a second time. "No, I will not allow it. I will turn every green thing to dust. I will freeze every river and crack every stone. I will make this world a wasteland, a tomb, a place where nothing lives and nothing grows, and I will do it gladly, and I will do it forever, before I let her go back to that place." The gods shifted uneasily. They had seen what Demeter's grief could do. They had watched the world wither and the mortals starve, and they knew, every one of them knew, that she meant exactly what she said. Zeus looked at Demeter. He looked at Hades, who stood in the shadows at the edge of the hall, his dark robes pooling around his feet like spilled ink. He looked at Persephone, who stood between them, between the light and the dark, between the world above and the world below, between the mother who loved her and the husband who had claimed her, and he made his judgment. 6 seeds, he said. 6 months. For each seed she swallowed, Persephone would spend 1 month in the underworld, as queen of the dead, as wife of Hades, as ruler of that vast and silent kingdom beneath the earth. And for the remaining 6 months, she would return to the surface, to the sunlight, to her mother's side, and the world would bloom again. It was a compromise. It satisfied no one completely. Demeter wept because 6 months was too many. Hades said nothing because 6 months was not enough. And Persephone stood in the center of it all, and she looked at the ground, and she thought of pomegranate seeds, and she thought of dark rivers, and she thought of flowers pushing up through hard earth, and she accepted it, because she understood, perhaps better than any of them, that some things cannot be whole, that some stories do not have endings that are purely happy or purely sad, but are instead something in between, something bittersweet, something true. And so it was, and so it is. Every year, when the leaves begin to turn and the air grows cold, and the days grow short, Persephone descends. She walks the long, dark road back to the underworld, back to the palace of black stone, back to Hades, who waits for her at the gate with his quiet eyes and his quiet love. And Demeter mourns, and the world mourns with her. The flowers die, the trees go bare, the earth turns hard and cold, and the snow falls soft and silent over everything, like a blanket, like a shroud, like a mother's arms wrapping around a sleeping child. This is winter. This is the world holding its breath. This is the long, still pause between one heartbeat and the next. But then, always, always, spring returns. Persephone climbs the long road upward, and the light finds her face, and the warmth finds her skin, and she steps out into the world, and the world remembers how to live. The snow melts, the rivers run, the first green shoots push up to the dark soil, tentative and brave, reaching for the sun. The flowers bloom, crocuses first, then hyacinths, then narcissus, then all the rest. A great wave of color and fragrance and life rolling across the land like a song, like a promise, like a homecoming. And Demeter smiles, and the fields turn gold, and the fruit hangs heavy on the branch, and the world is warm and full and abundant, and it will stay that way for a while, for 6 bright, beautiful months, until the leaves turn again, and the air grows cold, and Persephone looks toward the south, toward the cave, toward the long road down, and the cycle begins once more. This is the story of Persephone. It is a story about seasons, about the turning of the year, about why the world blooms and why it withers, and why it blooms again. But it is also a story about something deeper, about loss and return, about darkness and light, about the things we carry with us from the places we have been, the way they change us, the way they make us who we are. Persephone was taken into the dark, and in the dark she found something, not happiness exactly, not contentment, but a kind of understanding, a kind of strength, a kind of quiet, fierce grace that could only have been forged in that place, in that silence, in that long and difficult night. She ate the seeds, she made her choice, or the choice was made for her, or perhaps it was something in between, something more complicated than blame or innocence, something human and messy and real. And she lives now between 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither, carrying pieces of both inside her wherever she goes. The memory of flowers, the taste of pomegranate, the warmth of the sun, the cool of the stone, her mother's embrace, her husband's quiet gaze, and the world turns around her. Summer and winter, light and dark, growth and rest. An endless, gentle, beautiful cycle, as old as the earth itself, as certain as the rising of the sun, as steady and faithful as the beating of your own heart. So close your eyes now. Let the story settle over you like a warm blanket, like soft earth, like the first snow of winter or the first light of spring. Let the images drift. The meadow of Nysa, the dark rivers of the underworld, the pomegranate in Persephone's hand, the flowers blooming on the barren hillside, Demeter's arms around her daughter, the sun breaking through the clouds. You do not need to hold any of it. You do not need to remember. The story will be here when you wake, just as spring will be here when winter ends, just as the light will be here when the darkness passes. For now, just breathe. Breathe in, slowly, deeply, and breathe out, letting everything go. The world is turning, the seasons are changing, and you are safe and you are warm, and you are exactly where you need to be. Let sleep come now, gently, like Persephone walking up through the dark toward the light. Let it come like the first flower of spring, pushing up through the cold earth, small and brave and full of quiet promise. Let it come, and rest.